Strategy number 7, facilitate communication tasks. Users of software program always feel the need to communicate about their work. A manual should be designed in terms of how users communicate with the manual or the program rather than narrow view of the program feature. So the focus will be in order to help the users communicate with the program. So usually we or users require software to communicate about their work. Before we follow, what do we mean by communication tasks? Communication tasks are tasks that require communication between users and depend on the user's workplace. So as we mentioned, communication tasks depend on the user's workplace demands. As an example, there are, for example, print functions, report functions, disk output functions, data transfer functions are examples of functions that support communication tasks. Usually, designers need to learn about the user's interaction with the system so they will be able to communicate or to facilitate the communication tasks. Strategy number 8, encourage user communities. Users often need encouragement to rely on other users of the program. People, they work in teams, so they might need some other people so they can perform their job. So any task-oriented documentation encourages users to identify and get help from others so they can perform their jobs. Other users of the program, not experts, can render valuable help because they understand the user's job demand. To foster users' communication, we use, for example, mailing lists, contact lists, article archives. These days, we have, for example, blogs, virtual environments, or virtual communities that we use in order to share ideas about the program and progress. Strategy number 9, support cognitive processing. While completing a task, users work with their own mental models. These mental models we call a cognitive schema. So what do we mean by cognitive schema, or how cognitive schema works? Cognitive schema helps them or help the user learn new information, process the information, and apply the information that comes to them at alarming faster and faster rates. So exactly what happens when you get used to a specific kind of knowledge or specific kind of activity, when you face it again, you will do it faster because you have basic knowledge or basic schema about it. In task-oriented manuals, uses principles that support, like cognitive processing, such as representation, parallelism, and analogy that will help to convey software features and applications to work place. Principles of software documentation. The more a manual can support productive work, the greater the chance of acceptance and satisfaction by the user. That means it makes users proficient and efficient in their job, and proficient now in their software and efficient in their job. And those are the main two objectives or goal for the task-oriented document. Any manual writer job consists of constructing documents that helps the user what? First, learn to work with the programs in standard and new ways. Second, keep tracks of the level of user expertise. And third one, adapting programs, component capabilities to the specific purpose and goals of the job of the user job. There are two types of manuals: default manual and a task-oriented manual. Here we will talk about a default manual. Default manuals cover features of the program for which it designs. So the main here, when we design any default manual, we'll try to cover all the features and menu items in our software. There are two types of users of any software. There are users who need to learn about menu functions and commands, and those we call them default users. And there are users who try to use software for workplace and we call them task-oriented users. In past, the manuals and help system tend to focus on default users. So in the past, all the manuals or existing manuals were default manuals, and the focus was in the user manual. Their assumption was if a user can understand how the program works, she can figure out how to apply it in the workplace. That's true, but there's like some problem here. If we force the user to learn all the features so they can perform specific tasks in their environment, that means we are wasting their time. So in task oriented, we have a task oriented documentation. We focus only on the tasks that are needed so the user can complete or finish their job. Again, on the default manuals. The idea of basing computer manuals on program features is common in the computer industry today. These kind of manuals, they contain or create different sections such as using file menus and create table or form. These kind of document, they impose implicit role of technological ignorance. That means they assume that the user are ignorance in their software, or like there is or they doesn't have knowledge in their product or the program that they are using. And this kind of document or manual, they might have sections like this: read this manual before proceeding. This kind of statement or this kind of sections in, uh, assumes that the user or are ignorant in their uh, software. So it ignores the user workplace use of the program because they focus mainly on the features, on the program features, and it ignores the workplace and workplace environment. Also, it assumes one way of learning, which is the default uh, 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 way of following a menu or program. In this section and the following section, we will talk about some of the characteristics for the default user. So any default user is the user defined by the default manual. The characteristics for the default user, such as perceived job skills as decreasing in importance, sees use of computers as separate from job goals, becomes isolated from other users, fears remote supervision, suffers from information overloaded. The brief overview of these characteristics can demonstrate the challenges faced by the document writer. So each one of these characteristics can be considered as a challenge that faces the default users who are dealing with any default manual. As we mentioned earlier, there are a set of challenges. The first one is decrease importance of job skills. That means they will feel that their skills are not important anymore. So computer programs can perform many jobs that a person used to perform. So that job requires less skilled people. So those kind of users, they will say, my experience isn't good anymore, or they will feel like this. The second challenge or second characteristics is abstract nature of computer work. People have trouble seeing the link between doing by hand versus doing by computer. And they will ask themselves, I just cannot understand how this thing works. They don't know what's the link or what's the relation between the program features and what they are doing in their environment. A third characteristics or challenge, increasing isolated from other employees. Virtual organization are the recent trend. Those type of users, they will feel that they are stuck in front of their computer. They are not doing anything uh, important. Characteristic number 4, remotely supervised. Computer mediated user will feel increased isolation but increased supervision. For example, these days the manager can check on a project electronically if it's uploaded or updated, so they can watch the users or the team members or their employees progress. So there is no need for the manager to walk to somebody's desk to see their progress. So that makes default users feel that my boss has an electronic leash on me. It's like that they are holding them on a leash or they are monitoring their progress. The fifth characteristics is overloaded with information. Those kind of users, any new piece of information for them, they consider it as something new that they want to learn, something heavy on them. So some users resist computers because they feel overloaded by information that make them feel information and anxiety. Okay, so that's why we often use wizard if users cannot follow up on an installation instruction. For example, most of you, they use software and they try to install software. When we install the software, we use the wizard. The wizard is our way to make the process easy for the default users, because if we want to make them follow the right process, that will make them enter values and will make it too much information for them. So those users, they feel, why do I need to know that? And this is what we call information anxiety, when they feel loaded with information. The second type of users are the task-oriented users. And those kind of users are users that need the software to meet the workplace objectives. They don't focus on the user, like, menu items or on the software menu items. They focus on the what they need exactly from it, what kind of features they need in order to perform their task. Those kind of users, the task-oriented user, have some characteristics: challenged by predefined work activities, conceptually oriented, aware of user communities, self-managing, supplied with resources. If you think about each one of this, they are the opposite of the default users. Next, we will explain each one of these features or each character. Characteristics number 1, challenge by skill demands. Challenged by skill demands, also software can perform some of the skills of the skilled employees. There are some kind of complex tasks that need sophisticated professional knowledge. So basically, yes, the software can perform many of the jobs for us that the user or the employee used to perform. But there is still some kind of complex tasks that the software cannot perform by itself. They need some kind of input. They need some kind of knowledge from the user to enter. These kind of activity, the way that default, the task-oriented manual feel when they deal with the software. So computer activities require two kinds of efforts: actions and operations. So what we mean by actions? Actions, tasks that grow out of work situation that often require communication, and operation include limited efforts, often defined by menu items of the program. Next, we will explain it using this slide gives a brief representation for what we mean by activity, actions, and operations. When we use, for example, Word processor or Microsoft Word. So the activity that we want to do, we want to use Microsoft Word. Why we want to use it? What kind of action we want to do? Do we want to write a letter, write a report, take notes? So in order to perform any of these actions, we need to go and follow some kind of operation. So we need to open a file, set margins, check spellings, and selecting a specific font. So that's the main differences, or what we mean by activity, action, and operation. The second characteristic is conceptually oriented. There are some kind of abstract concepts such as data types and processing instructions that can make work or computer work difficult. So technical writers have always faced the challenge of explaining such kind of data and high technical information for novice readers. But for them, they feel of this that this is a new challenge or something that they can learn from it. So when they deal with some kind of data or abstract data, they feel that gives them something new to think about it. This is challenge, so they can learn from. Characteristic number 3, aware of user communities. We said that default users feel isolated from the friends or from the community, but here the default manual users, they feel that they are aware of the user communities. So computer support divisions in corporation have discovered an increase in user acceptance of software when they encourage the formation of user groups. So when people work in groups to perform their job, that will encourage them and help them to be a professional in their job. Mostly users work in groups and as a result have to coordinate their activities, share work in progress, and store the results. So in order to be able to this, that we have to be able, or you have to be aware of the community and your friends. Information these days represent the source of power and authority. Characteristic number 4, self-managing. My software helps me sort out my work. So the programs will do this and you can do this with the program. This is how the default manual users feel. Characteristic number 5, information rich. Default users or default manual users, they feel information anxiety. So any new piece of information that they have to learn, that cause them information anxiety. But here we, or the default manual, the task-oriented manual, feel information rich. My software gives me a better view of my task. So information has become the currency these days. Those who control information about production, statistics, deadlines, and histories can use it to acquire important resources or plan efficiently. So if you have the knowledge, have the information, you can plan and can be more productive. Figure 1.3 from your textbook, it brings a comparison between the two types of users, the default user and the task-oriented user that we mentioned in the previous slides. At the beginning of the chapter, we said that users usually use different forms of software documentation. These documents are tutorials, procedures, and references. So what are the tutorial documentation? It's kind of a document that intends to teach the basic functions and features of a program to users in such a way that that person can begin applying the program to work activity. So basically, the intention is to teach for the simple or basic program features for those naive users. From the example, there are different types of tutorials. From the examples like getting started guides, print and online tutorials. These are examples or kinds of the tutorials documentation. The second type is the procedural documentation. This kind of document intends to guide the user in every use of the program, often when the user needs information at the time of use. So the intention here is to guide. Here, the intention is to teach. From the examples of the procedural documentation like user guides, help files, frequently asked question, etc. This consists of step-by-step procedure tips, suggestions, wizards, pop-ups, and screen helps. These are the elements or the components of any procedural document. The third type of documentation is a reference documentation. This kind of document intends to supply information about the program for advanced users. Reference users rarely consult the tutorial or user guide. They ignore introductions. The specific task the user needs to accomplish is not defined by the manual writer, but by the user. So exactly the users, they define what exactly they want to learn from their manual. This is purely descriptive of the program itself rather than the user's application of the program. Examples of such kind of or of the references documentation are the quick reference guides. This table offers a comparison between the three types of documentation: the tutorial, procedural, and reference type. The comparison is based on the motivation, what kind of relation, this kind of document built with the reader, what kind of features that are needed or elements are needed to define the task, and what on which kind of features they focus. So basically, the tutorial, they motivate to teach or to learn. They try to build a relation, a teacher and learner relation with the reader. In order to define their task, they use scenarios, cases, and examples, and they focus on basic actions. The procedural, they perform routine tasks. They build a relation like guide and mentor. In order to define their task, they use chronological and step-by-step structure, and they focus on operation organized around the workplace activity. Reference, they intend or to motivate to obtain information about the program. The kind of relationship is resource and the client, and the users define their task as we mentioned earlier, and the focus on the whole program features. Processes of software documentation. A user manual should follow the users themselves and not the program. In order for the task orientation document to be successful, the process should first start with analyzing the user in his/her work environment to discover what kind of activities within which the manual and program must fit. So the most important activity that the software documentation process should start with is analyzing the user. So for example, instead of writing down the features of the software and focusing on the program menu items, we have to spend time watching actual users interact with the system itself. Following with the processes of software documentation. This process begins by exploring what users are using the software for, taking that human approach. This is a process of exploring user needs, means analyzing the user, then of constant involvement of the user in the process of writing and testing. That means the process involves user analysis, writing, developing like the document, and testing the document. We call the whole process as the usability process. Users and their needs derive the writing. So like the writing for the document depends on the user needs. If we will go back to figure 1.8, it shows different stages of software documentation or usability process phases. These phases include planning, development, which is the writing of the documentation, and testing, which is the evaluation stage. So what do we mean by usability process? This will be explained in the next slide. Usability process can be defined as the process of writing task-oriented documents that involves the user in all stages of writing to ensure an appropriate fit with the workplace activity. So it's a method or a process we follow that consists of set of phases. During these phases, we involve the user so we can produce a good and usable software document. This process consists of three stages. First phase, which is the planning stage, then a development stage, and we finally end with the evaluation phase. During the planning stage, we conduct user interviews to find out what actions user take while using software. Also, we perform focus groups to find out user needs and organizational constraints. So basically, the main focus of this phase, which is the planning stage, we try to analyze the user and the organization in order to know what kind of task needed to be included in our document and what kind of constraints on these tasks or on the document itself. The second phase, which is the development stage. During the development stage, we conduct user reviews, user lab tests, and user field tests. This development stage can be called also as the writing stage. During the user reviews, we try to see how will the manual fit with the workplace tasks. Then we conduct user lab tests to measure the accuracy of the manual and help information. And finally, we conduct field tests to gather additional information about the workplace uses. The third stage of or phase of the usability process is the evaluation stage and can be called the testing stage. During this phase, we do user field evaluation to assess the overall value of the document, and also we conduct a user usage report to help adjust writing and research process for the subsequent releases, and so we can get some feedback for the next versions of the documentation or to improve the next version or releases of our document. Part 2, the second part of this chapter will give a brief overview about the task list. For any document consists of set of tasks. Now, how we can prepare this list? How can we describe this list? What kind of things we use to describe each task? Okay, the next few slides will help us to present the task list using examples and describe how we can describe each task in separate. Task list construction. How we construct a task list. In this section, we have to learn how to analyze the tasks. When we analyze, that means analyze the task, we mean prepare what we call the task list for any software program. Also, put these tasks in a form called a task description. And third thing, we need to know what kind of components or things we need to include in each task description. So any task description might contain the task name, some descriptive details, who perform these tasks, the starting and goal state for the task, what kind of steps, options, alternatives, and kind of screens needed in order to be able to describe or to explain this task. Example of task lists for the NetBeans application or software. For example, if we think about in NetBeans, what kind of tasks that we are using in general as students or as academic people. We install the software, create a project, open an existing project, compiling a project, running, debugging a project, adding a file to a project, and printing a file. These 7 tasks, uh, can be considered as a task list for the NetBeans application. Again, with the task list construction, what are the guidelines, the steps that we need to follow in order to define a good task list? First, we have to determine the right level of detail. Categorize the program tasks. Link the task with the menu features. Write the steps and test the task list. Guideline number 1, determine the right level of detail. This depends on the user who will write the document. Individuals or groups. Groups, for example, require more detail than individuals. Second thing, the interface. More complex interface requires more details. So the level of detail that we need to include in our task depends on the type of users who will write the document and the interface that are need to be explained and it's their complete. Second guideline, categorize the program tasks. We have to put the tasks in groups. For example, we can use the end user or the end use tasks. Task put the software to work. These are the kind of tasks that the user or the end user use in general, like starting a program, processing, opening a file, search for a record. The second, for example, the second category can be the installation task, the task that get the software onto the user system, that the task need to be used in order to be able to install and build the software in your system. For example, getting the program from the distribution, downloading it, running it, and installing it. These are kind of tasks required or can be put in an installation category. Third, the category, the configuration, which is tasks get the software set up right. For example, in order to maintain security and safety in my software, we have to put some kind of configuration. The tasks that allow us to maintain security and safety, for example, are kind of tasks related to the configuration and can be put under the configuration, like, category. For example, setting options, setting preferences, customizing the software, all these are kind of uh, categories like related to the configuration. Task description. We mentioned earlier that in order to describe any task, we need to have some kind of elements or features. For example, we need a task name. We need to put some kind of steps, what kind of options or alternatives we need. Do we have kind of screens or what the type of screens? For example, if we are trying to describe the transfer a file task, the kind of steps we have to follow, for example, we have to select the transfer from the file menu, select the desired file, click the transfer button. Now, what kind of options or alternatives we might have? Sometimes we might have complex interface. We might need to switch to another drive because, like, the file that we trying to transfer not in the default drive. For example, you might need to cancel the transfer operation while it's transferring. So these kind of alternative or options we might need to do during the process. For example, the screen. Do we have a complex screen? Do we need to show the screen? These are the kind of options or like the elements that need to include, for example, in any task description.